what I want to say. Should say, I better say something. I don't have any, I'm not doing this with notes. I'm just doing this with the timeline. That I don't know. So far, I keep listening to the feeds and I don't find anything fun. What I mostly worry about is that I said something wrong that I don't know about, but I haven't found anything listening to it that I know is wrong. So that's at least a start. And nobody's yelled at me yet, so, you know.
I keep meaning to go get my church history books and reread this stuff.
Oh, that reminds me, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's all this stuff is on the internet. I mean, you can look at it on your phones while I'm talking, and I wish you would. But yeah, I talked about this book, which I bought it 2 or 3 times because I gave it away as Christmas presents for a while. This is a great book, but I noticed it's out of print in paperback, and all there is a hardcover. I don't know what's going on there, but it's really handy. It's like 2 pages. I think I see Martin Luther and Francis Schaeffer. Is that Francis Schaeffer on the right there? This guy right there?
For Martin Luther and Spurgeon.
That's Spurgeon right there?
Yeah.
He doesn't look like I thought he would.
You didn't know what Spurgeon looked like that.
Anyway, great leaders of the Christian church. Starting from day one. Good book. All right. Here we are. This is a timeline we've been working through. What we're interested in is the times in which we live are very confusing right now. I mean, if you were born in, I mean, the pace of change is extraordinary. I was born in 62. So think about 1962, since the Kennedy assassination. You know, you had the Vietnam War. I mean, just work through the decades. But go back earlier, you know, there was this woman who was, they thought 129, she was the oldest person in the world that they knew of until she died some number of years ago. But, you know, if it was 10 years ago, go back 130 years from 2015, let's call it 2010. Might have been that long ago. Go back 130 years. Man, if she really, it's so old that they didn't have any record of her birth. There's no way to establish that. But assuming that it was, you know, 1870 or 80, I guess it would be more like 1880. Man, you're talking about in Russia. She was in Georgia, over in that part of the world, the Caucasus. I think that's the Caucasus, right? But just think about the change and the world that she experienced from, you know, she's born in the Tsarist period. You know, then she's World War I, the rise of Leninism, then Stalinism, you know, the Bolshevik Revolution, World War II, the purges in the 30s under Stalin, the purges and collectivization when 20 million, they lose track of these numbers, died. World War II, post-World War era, you know, the rise of the jet age and the automobile, the computer age. It's extraordinary, the pace of change, but it's only, in a sense, it's really only accelerated. And you just get used to it and you get numb to it. You don't think about it. But if you're 10 years old today, you were born in 2015, your life experience is pretty hectic as far as looking at the world around you, what's happened since 2015, the last 3 election cycles and so forth. And so if the families are not stable, then the people, the children born into those periods their lives are commotion. Their lives are chaos. The public schools are chaos. Everything is chaos. And what that does to individual identity. And now you have a culture which is just ready, willing, and able to swoop in and define your identity. When they're not trying to define your identity, they're trying to subvert it. They're trying to subvert your identity in some way, or tell you that your identity is evil or something, like just by innately because of what you are. You know, and that's the world. And it leads to this deep-seated sense of insecurity and nihilistic insecurity, and then compensations and so forth. That's where we are today. And, you know, talk about Jesus being the rock and so forth. Christ the solid rock, these songs, man, that really means something today. I mean, it was tough it was, you know, they were dealing with physical problems that we can have no experience of. How to put food on the table every single day in Jesus' time, even in Rome, it didn't matter. Where you were day laborers, you know, those stories of the day laborers that Jesus tells the parables about. You know, these people don't work today, they don't eat today. Their families don't eat today,
You think about their diet, I mean,
their diet, yeah.
if I remember correctly, the most common form of meat they had, at least in Galilee, was fish, tilapia. That was their main source of protein, on the feast, and they would get to eat, you know, the sacrificial animal.
Yeah, they didn't eat a lot of meat
They didn't eat a lot of meat.
back then. The standard diet in Rome for the laborer, for the person on the street. There's I've told you about the great courses, and there's the rise of the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. That's a great series of lectures. And then the rise and fall, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. That's a great series. But the one on the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the empire, he made the statement in there that they would eat 3 times a day. They would eat wheat, olive oil, and red wine. That was the diet. And then what you could get, maybe. So why then, if we don't have to worry about that sort of stuff, we're back to it, right? Why the rise in teen suicide and all these other dysfunctions that seem to be dominating our culture, and the rape? It's one of the remarkable ironies of our time that we live in the time of greatest ease and comfort ever. We eat like kings. We own houses, kings and queens. We own houses. You know,
We're still victims.
Yet, you know, alcoholism and drug use and
Oh,
suicide rates, and also just simply, there seems to be this innate rage and dissatisfaction in the culture. That's what we're talking about, and that's what we're headed towards, and talking about that sort of thing, and the church in the midst of that. Go ahead.
hey, we had, as over 14 foster kids that we raised for certain amounts of time. One girl, we were gonna adopt her one time. The first time she was with us, she was just in middle school, maybe 8th grade. And I remember she was suicidal. She was, I mean, many a night I had to stay in the ER with her because the parent had to be with her in the ER, and we had also younger children at home too. So I was with her, and I remember reading a post on one of her social medias where somebody says, "Why don't you just go ahead and off yourself?" Cyberbullying has a lot to do with it, but there's another thing, and that's the teaching that has pervaded the public school system today, where really there's no real purpose in life. We're just here for now. I think that leads a lot towards that suicide.
Where is it? Let me find it. Nihilism.
Yeah.
Nihilism, the great struggle of our times. It's so endemic and natural that we don't even notice it. I call it that sinking feeling. The universe exists for no purpose. Nobody verbalizes it this way, but you get a sense of it just in your daily life. The universe exists. You fear that. You fear that the universe exists for no purpose, has no end in mind, is destined for extinction, and human life is not even an afterthought. Doesn't matter. Meaningless, insignificant, and has no intrinsic value. And then you internalize that as a struggle in your own existence. And then you end up with these schools like existentialism and so forth, which we're not going to talk about because I don't know enough to talk about them. Ways of coping mechanisms that everybody has to deal with this nihilistic sense. It's either coping or narcissism, which is nihilism's offspring. Ugly stepchild, which is also the curse of the scourge of our time. The one follows from the other. Narcissism follows from nihilism, like day follows night, or night follows day, I guess would be more accurate. One of the movies that presents that narcissism, nihilistic narcissism, very acutely, that I can't recommend because it's just harsh, is Fight Club. I thought it's one of the best presentations of narcissism out there in movies. There's lots of those. There's lots of narcissist movies that portray narcissism, but that's one of them. Anyway, that's what we're talking about. You know, how do we get here? From a culture, we talked about this time log, from a timeline, from a culture that had an overarching religious narrative that explained origins and our place in the universe. You know, Constantine's legacy somewhere. Should probably not do this. The legacy of Constantine, right? And what began probably with the Nicene Creed for the culture. Remember, the Nicene Creed was written not just for the church. The Nicene Creed was written for the culture. It's sort of a new cultural mandate, a blueprint for moving forward for everyone in a sense. But it's a cultural statement as well. It's a cultural manifesto and not just a religious one. I'm making this up. I'm thinking about this right now, but it seems to me it functioned that way. There is one universal, unchallenged religious narrative that explains human origins, human sin, and God's authority over the created order. They did not doubt the creator, that he exists. This narrative, there's a double word there, look at that. Narrative was shared throughout European society across social classes from peasant to philosopher to landowner to king. Also of relevance for us back at that time, there is a common moral foundation rooted in this narrative to organize social institutions and provide social cohesion. We will inherit that at the founding of this nation, that need for a religious narrative, which we had. We maintained that narrative from medieval period, from what we often call from what it was often called the pre-modern era, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are. But there's the creator embedded in that religious narrative right there. And then to our point today, every person, this is what they would have thought of it, every person has an immutable essence, an unchanging essence that transcends experience and will and endures over time. And we are in an age, in my opinion, that I would call post-individual. In the Enlightenment, you're going to see the rise of individualism and liberty, individual liberty. It's the ascendancy of individual liberty, and that has been overthrown, probably in both cases, but certainly that the very idea of the individual is subverted, individual identity. The idea that there's a permanent individual in there, permanent identity in there, that does change, but remains in essence what it was. You are the same person you were 50 years ago. In one way you're not, but in another way you are. You are still who you were. That's why somebody 50 years later can see you and still know you. But that has been subverted in our culture because we've inherited from the postmodernity this idea of subversion and transgression. And so everything gets subverted. And one of the things that got subverted was the very idea of individual identity. And now individual identity is customizable. It's whatever, it's a style. It's a presentation you make, it's a perspective you take on yourself, and you present that. So you identify as something. You have an outward facing, your identity is almost entirely outward facing and subjective and changeable. And so you're supposed to, I guess in a sense, have fun with that. Right, and explore your identity or your many identities or something like that. That's where we are today. It's so far away from where they were, even 50 years ago. Not even the 60s boomers would have. I'm not a 60s boomer. I'm a 70s boomer. But this is alien to all of that too. This is a new thing. This is within the last even 10 years, maybe. We've moved on from post-modernity to the post-individual, and now there's a backlash going on of some kind. There's a reaction against that in a culture saying, or elements of the culture saying, wait a minute, We can't go there. That doesn't work. That's wrong. The hunch is wrong. The hunch that we have no permanent identity, that an individual is whatever he decides he is, and when he wakes up in the morning, just doesn't seem right. And when you don't have the hunch on your side, ultimately you're going to end up losing. That's the trouble that Marxism in all its forms has. The hunch is not on the side of the Marxists. They have this idea that there's an inevitability to human history. The history is on their side, and they'll talk like that. But if so, why does it keep ending up in failure, and usually brutal, totalitarian, awful failure? And I firmly believe that what we are experiencing today is the collapse of what we could call cultural Marxism in American life. And we'll get back to that. And I've hedged a lot on this stuff because I don't know that, but I'll talk about cultural Marxism when we get there. It's fundamentally important to what's going on in our world today and in regard to the church. Because remember that Christianity is, any form of Marxism is openly hostile to any form of Christianity or religious authority, period. So we'll get back to that. We'll nuance that later. All right, go back to our timeline. This is what we've been talking about. We just got done with Augustine. The most significant religious figure in the history of Western civilization since his time. Of course, you have Jesus before that. For those of you that haven't seen this before, these are the people, I pulled out 10 names that I think are the 10 most significant personalities, thinkers, presences in in history of Western civilization since the time of Jesus for understanding our world today. And if you disagree with it, that's fine. Just let me know what you think. But those are the ones that I came up with. And so we've just finished with Gregory, actually. We talked about how, in my view, Gregory, if you're going to get a starting point for the first, if you want a pope number one, in my opinion, it's Gregory. Some people out there with a different religious bent will say, we'll take it all the way back to Peter. I don't think there's any way to do that, either biblically or even from a secular timeline, from a secular historical standpoint. I don't think you can do that. I don't think that works. But from a secular standpoint, I'm going to say Gregory was the first. And he was also called Gregory the Great, fundamentally for that very reason. And we're also seeing at this point then the rise of the church in Rome. The Pope, by definition, is the Bishop of Rome. And so we have then the ascendancy in the West of the Latin Church in Rome. And with the Latin Church comes the Latin translation of the Bible by Jerome, the Latin Vulgate, which will reign supreme now for 1,000 years. And that will begin to be subverted during the period of the authoritative presence of the church and its Latinness, the Latin Mass, and and the supremacy of Latin as the mediating language for understanding the Word of God will begin to get subverted during the period of the Renaissance, with the rise of well, with all kinds of presences, and I cannot talk to the Renaissance hardly at all, so I'm just going to put it out there as that's when it started. But we'll get back to that after we talk about the Black Plague. But anyway, it's now a Latin church in the West. We're going to leave the Eastern Church behind, except to mention the Great Schism, which I mean, you could say that that's a great crack in the edifice as well of the Latin Church, because you have an East-West break, right? You have an East-West church. You have a church in the East. Where's my? Here I'm wandering around. You have a church in the East and a church in the West. One in Byzantium, which is anachronistic. It's Constantinople at that time. But you have an Eastern Greek church, Orthodox church, and you have a Western Latin church based in Rome. And we will now leave behind except to talk about the Great Schism. With the Great Schism, we would leave behind the Greek church, because all the action from our vantage point is going to be what happened in the West. But this is now going to be in 1054, then you're going to see a formal split. A formal split on for a lot of reasons between East and West. One of which is just simply, I mean, it was coming all along, right? You got these two different, you got this language thing. You have the distance, talking about 1,000 miles. What is it? Distance between Constantinople or Byzantium and Rome. Languages, but more fundamentally, the question of the authority of the Roman bishop, the Pope. And in the East, they were not having it. And so the church, they broke, and they rejected the authority of the supremacy, if you will, of that bishop in Rome. And it figures that they would, because they have their own. And so they went their own, they went in two different directions. It's not like you have one line, and then at the Great Schism, the Greek church forks away from the one line. It's the line moves, and then there's one going one way and one going the other way. There's now fundamentally two churches, a Greek Orthodox church, a Greek church, and a Latin church. And now we're going to be interested in following the Latin church because of that's where all the action is going to be as we move forward. And that happened in 1054. But all through this period now in the West, the Latin Vulgate and the Latin Mass, and these are religiously the dominant things. And you're seeing the coalescence, the consolidating of this church-state fusion, right? That will be known as Christendom. Society is Christian society, and that'll be important during the period of the Protestant Reformation, when these issues will come to the fore, particularly for example, the Puritans and even the founders. We arose out of that sort of reaction against Christendom and this authoritative church-state mechanism that just wasn't, with the Puritans, just, we're not living under that anymore. And so they set off on this hazardous new life, if you will, to the new world. I really wish we had Gamason here, because he's an expert on this stuff at this point. I'm not, but maybe we'll talk a little bit. I'll say what I know about the Puritans when we get there, but the caricature. Yeah, we could do that. He could explain it, but the caricature, what you know in popular culture, is a caricature of the Puritans. So that's about all I want to say about that. You'll notice there's a big, that's all I'll say about the Greek church right here. It's important, except for one more thing. It's important to understand that manuscript copying continued to happen in Greek on the eastern side of the empire, century after century. So that today we have thousands of Greek manuscripts, fragments, copies of manuscripts, copies of portions of manuscripts and fragments that have been unearthed over the course of, have survived over the centuries. In the West, we also have that with the Latin, which means that even if we didn't have any Greek manuscripts, we could still reproduce the Bible, the New Testament, from Latin as well. But we don't need to do that. That would become a fight. That will become a fight with William Tyndale.
Yeah.
That William Tyndale will take up in the English Reformation, and that Luther will take up in the German Reformation, and that the Renaissance, that will be taken up in the Renaissance by Wycliffe as well. The question, you wouldn't think that copying a Bible in a language other than Latin would be controversial, but let alone treasonous. But that's exactly where they were at this. That's what happens after 1,000 years. You just you don't question these sorts of things. Tradition becomes authoritative by virtue of it being tradition. period.
It's interesting at the Reformation time, Luther and Tyndale, and Greek had almost died as they weren't taught that in the seminaries, all they knew was Latin.
Latin.
And so these men had to teach themselves to read New Testament Greek and to read Hebrew so they could translate the Bible.
If they could find manuscripts, and we'll get back to, I can say something about that side of the Reformation and what follows. So you'll see this, you see this black part of the line between 600 and about 1350, 1347 to be exact. That's actually kind of representative in a lot of ways. One of the reasons they call it the Dark Ages is because we don't know a lot about it. And then they'll say things like, and I don't know how much of this is true, but they'll talk about how it was a period of cultural decline. It was certainly a period of empire decline, and maybe what goes with that is cultural decline. But that was all happening to some extent or another. We tend to think of the Dark Age. It gets what's the word for it? It gets illustrative. It becomes figurative. The Dark Ages because these people were primitive and superstitious and no, that's self-flattering. That's moderns thinking that they're better than the people that came before them. And lest I remind everyone today that if you lived in those times, you would have fallen right in line with exactly what they were doing. You don't know, for example, if you lived on a plantation in Georgia or South Carolina in the 1850s, whether you would have been a slaveholder and viewed a certain kind of people as beneath you. Don't imagine that you're superior to anyone. Now there's some postmodern relativism, social relativism that I just expressed right there, but we can talk about that later too, and I can talk about that as well. Anyway, so there's this period between 400, the writing of the Latin Vulgate, 400 and something by Jerome, and Wycliffe during the Renaissance, I think. We'll go back and look at Wycliffe in a minute, when Latin just reigned supreme in the church, period. And since they're not copying in Greek, they're copying in Latin, there aren't even any Greek manuscripts to work with. They're just not there. And so in a little bit, in the early 1500s, I think, if I got the dates right, Erasmus, a Roman Catholic scholar, will take up the task of creating a Greek text of the New Testament that first originated, that first originated with a Roman Catholic scholar, I think.
Yeah.
And when he does that, he will have some work to do. He's fundamentally important to the transmission of the New Testament text precisely for that reason. You wouldn't think we'd be so dependent on a Roman Catholic for this, but we really are. And we'll talk about the nuances of that, and Tyndale, and the King James Version that came on in 1611. What they have to do with each other, that's a fascinating story too. But anyway, that takes us to Aquinas in the late 1200s, another one of the great thinkers in the history of the church. He wrote two books, neither of which have I read, Summa Contra Gentilis and Summa Contra Theologica, in which he essentially answered every question. Did a pretty good job of it. But he among other things, I'll mention too, he formulated arguments for the existence of God. I'm not sure why you would be provoked to do that at a time when nobody questioned his existence, but he did. And he made some marvelous arguments for the existence of God, including one based on a prime mover. Those are worth reading. He does.
Was he the one that did the teleological?
Cosmological. He did them all.
Oh, I know you're on that one.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah.
the name again?
Which name of what?
That you were just talking about.
Thomas Aquinas, Roman Catholic scholar. The other thing he did was he formalized he formalized thinking on what we can call the mechanical transmission of grace through the sacraments. And he named 7. And his argument was that by virtue of participating in the sacrament, the Eucharist, for example, the taking of the host, or baptism, grace is conferred upon you by the act itself. I forget the Latin for that. But by the act itself, grace is mechanically transferred to you. By taking the host, you receive grace through that sacrament by the act itself. Thus, the fundamental importance of participating in the Mass. And that squarely puts the church in control as the mediator of grace, of the grace of God. So Aquinas had 7 of them. I'm not even going to list them because I can't remember every extreme unction, marriage, baptism, the Eucharist, First Communion. That's 5. I forget what the other 2 are.
Maybe,
But we would really focus on the Eucharist, on the Mass. I grew up Catholic, so I did that till I was 20 or so, 19 and 20 or something like that. And I was serious enough about it that I considered becoming a monk, I wanted to join a monastery when I was about 16, 17 years old, which seems funny now, not because that's so wrong. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that I would just have this random idea that you could just go do that on a whim. You know, we're talking about such fundamental transformation of your lifestyle and the lives of these monastics, these people, and the way that they live, and that I would just, as a 16 or 17-year-old, I even talked to a priest about it, Father Kina. But, you know, yeah, that's what I was thinking at that time. Anyway, where was I? So that's Thomas Aquinas. He's well worth reading a biography on, or just going on the internet and browsing his thinking, because he was so deep in his thinking, and he thought about everything. And they had thinkers like, a lot of these guys were scientists and philosophers and theologians and, you know, mathematicians.
I know Aquinas is studied in philosophy.
Yeah, oh yeah. Behold, Thomists. I mean, you have whole schools of thought that are, I mean, to a certain extent, we are. I mean, if you're making arguments for the existence of God, which I've done, that's a Thomist thing to do. But anyway, that's sort of the, I don't know what a formal establishment of of sacramental grace, grace through the sacraments. And the importance of grace through the sacraments is that it makes the church the mediator of grace, including the grace of forgiveness, the grace of salvation. So go ahead.
Well, it's interesting, because every time I think about this, I think about Ephesians 2:8. You know, for by grace are you saved. But they believe that firmly. It's
If they
just
do.
that the grace just comes through the
Yes.
sacraments, not just from God giving it to you because of
That's right.
faith.
And it is through faith.
Yeah.
It's not for non-believers. It's for believers. But you enter the church and you receive the sacrament of baptism. The point of the sacrament of baptism is that you are forgiven of original sin. The sin, and this is Augustinian, right? Original sin. That the grace of baptism, grace transferred upon you through baptism is that by which you are forgiven of original sin. What remains, therefore, is personal sin. And for personal sin, the sins you commit, that is the Eucharist. So you go, confession.
Confession.
Yeah, what am I talking about? Confess, which I remember going to. And through these sacraments, the grace is conferred upon you through these sacraments for the forgiveness of your personal sins, but through the church. It doesn't mean that people aren't devout or godly or pious and so forth. It's just this idea that the church is the mediator between God and man, and chiefly the Pope. Number one, which we can talk about if you want, but this is where they were at. This is where they're at coming into, for example, the Renaissance and the Black Plague. That you have this idea, particularly post Aquinas. Now I'm really on an edge here with what I know. But as I read it, particularly after Aquinas, where the church is firmly in control and authoritative on the question of even managing forgiveness. So you're talking about going to a mass, required, going to a mass, receiving a host, receiving the Eucharist for the forgiveness of personal sins or original sin through baptism, participating in a mass that's being conducted in a language that you don't even speak. And that Latin mass, that will not change. When did the Second Vatican Council? In the 1960s?
1960s sometime.
This is the big argument. You have the traditionalists, even today, you have traditionalists who think the mass should be in Latin. And then you have the, I don't know, contemporaryists and so forth who, you know, that was a big deal. To hold the mass in the vernacular instead of in Latin, that was a big deal.
Sect out there of the Catholic Church that split off from Roman Catholicism, and it said because of they going to the vernacular,
Yes.
and they've got their own pope and everything.
Yeah, we could get drawn into the other schism, which was the division of popes. That's also often called the Great Schism, where they ended up with 3 popes. Because, you know, if one pope claims authority and then you say, no, you're not the pope, we're going to go make another college of cardinals and we're going to make another pope. Well, the first pope, it's not like the first pope's going to step down. He's going to say, no, I'm still the pope. Well, now you got this other guy who says, no, I'm the pope. So now you have 2 popes. So then you say, well, we're going to end all that. We're going to get rid of both of you. We're going to start a third one. We're going to start a new one. Well, now you have 3. So now you got this pope who says he's authoritative, and then you got this pope, and now you got a new one that says he's, you know, don't do number 4. You got to solve this another way. But yeah, they ended up in that little problem at one point too. I don't know enough to talk about that either, so I don't know why I'm even mentioning it, except that it's out there. You can Google it. But so that's the direction the church was. And remember, this is going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. So you're born into this way of thinking and you die in this way of thinking. And all the while, you live in a world of church, state, a society that is church and state that's fused together. It's kind of almost, in a sense, like Judaism back in the day, in the Old Testament at some points. But so that's the important part that I want to talk about, as right or wrong as I am. And so now we arrive at the Black Plague and the effect. It's too bad Laura's in the feed. Maybe she'll have something to say about this. The transformative effect of what is called the Black Plague, the plague. That's how big it was. The Great Plague. You'll hear it talk about different ways. 1347 in Europe. It arrived 1347. The effect of that experience continues down through to today. So let's look at a. I think I opened a. Are you doing a map here? Yeah. I don't know why they're calling it the second pandemic. I looked into this and I'm not sure what's going on here with the second pandemic. Maybe somebody else does. But notice the timeline. We're right before, these are causally connected. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that the Renaissance is they're gonna date the Renaissance to shortly after the Black Plague. And then the Protestant Reformation is basically during the Renaissance, or at the end of what they call maybe it brings to the end of one thing to be transitional to another. And then the Enlightenment is going to follow the Reformation. And then the 30 Years' War, the religious wars are going to follow that. None of that those are all causally connected. But anyway, in 1346, moving out of China, best guess. I don't know how you establish numbers for this, but this plague, this disease, bubonic plague, actually there's 3 forms of plague. I think I looked at this too.
That one came from China too?
Yes, yes, that's not the only ones either. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we're gonna move right along.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a bacterial infection. It's a bacterial infection through fleas that are carried by rats. And there are three forms. That you can get. I mean, you can get plague from flea bites or other, I don't know, probably other kind of insects. I don't know. There can be airborne droplets like COVID was. That's why it was a big deal with COVID when they were trying to figure out whether it was airborne, whether you could, like the flu, they need to know whether pneumatic, I think that's the term, whether you can get it with it, whether it comes through the air or do you have to come in contact with it. And so both of those are true with plague, and then the third, contaminated fluid or tissue and so forth. The pneumatic one is the most lethal, and by most lethal, I mean like 99%. Everybody who gets it dies. The issue with a plague that is a pandemic that is that virulent, that's the word, that deadly, another one is Ebola, maybe Ebola is that deadly as well, is they die out quick because they can't get hosts. When everybody it touches dies, it can't transmit any further, so it dies more quickly. But in this case, you also have the bubonic plague, which was transmitted through flea bites or person-to-person contaminated fluid or tissue. And so that's the transmission mechanisms. And you know, it's swept across. It comes in on these trade routes from China. You've heard of the Silk Road, maybe. Marco Polo and so Venice and so forth. And they bring it back with them, both by land and, more importantly, for the plague, by sea.
What is the significance of the colors there?
That's when the waves hit.
Oh, in the areas. that-
Yeah, you remember how fast COVID hit? Well, it had already hit even prior to March of 2020. You know, they call it COVID-19. But when it hit, because of the mobility of modern culture, it was all over the world within day. I mean, I don't know how short the period was, but there was no delay. It's not like you were going to be able to protect yourself because it's not here yet, right? I mean, when you're talking about, that was the problem with New York. When you put that many people on mass transit in the subway and they're coming in from all over the world, which was what was happening, and then they get in the subway and they're breathing and so, and then it's all back out again, forget it.
But breathing is a good thing.
Breathing is a good thing, yeah. Yeah, there's no stopping it in that sense, yeah. And so, and that's even though we know the transmission mechanisms. Put yourself back then, you didn't know anything about this stuff and how this was transmitted. The very idea of a germ, bacterium, I mean, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, you can see these black lines as it makes its way via trading ships up the coast. And so by 1348 and then 1349, and then you can see it kind of sweeping like this across Europe. And so pretty soon, you know, if you're up here, you know it's coming because you can see it progress. And so how are you going to protect yourself? How do you protect yourself from this thing that's happening? You have no idea what the transmission mechanism is or how it's happening. And so one of the things you might try to do is keep people out of your city. Or another thing you might do is if somebody dies of plague, gets plague, everybody runs to the next village, taking it with them.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's total. I mean, it's a kind of mass panic. That I think that was probably in a sense what was behind the mass hysteria, in my view, with regard to COVID. They had visions of the plague or the Spanish flu in the early 1900s. And, you know, 3% of the world's population died of the Spanish flu. 10% mortality rate. 50 million out of 500 million. I don't remember the numbers. I don't think I'm making this up. 500 million got it, 50 million died. You can chalk that up to World War I as well, another cost of World War I. The damage that war did It's incalculable. Aside from giving us Adolf Hitler.
It's interesting, the gray area, they're relatively unaffected, you know, that must be like, parts of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, looks like,
Maybe it's extremely rural.
you
There's
know.
no urban centers. Paris lost half its population. I think Venice and Florence were the same way, just wipeouts. They find these mass graves and they can evaluate the bones. They can do studies on the bones. It's all of our DNA has been affected by it. I've been watching this documentary on it one time. There's a percent of the population of the world that's immune to HIV because of genetic changes brought about by the plague. Something like that, or yeah, that's a virus. I don't know why that would happen, but I mean, for all you know, I'm making this up, so you can Google it.
Actually, I heard something about that too, and they were saying that there was a group of people that survived the plague, and they tended to be the Christians who were trusting the Lord, who went out and actually helped others that were dying of the plague when other people wouldn't go near them. And they think they developed some sort of immunity to it. I don't know, but I thought that was very interesting look
here's
at
what
that.
Here's what I think about that. That as people do that, what's going to happen is if you're helping people, let's say it has a, the form bubonic plague has a 50% death rate. So 50% of the people that come in contact with it die, and 50% don't. And of the 50% that don't, a certain cross section of that is going to have some kind of immunity. Those are the ones that are going to survive. So if the Christians are the ones who are doing this, that are actually helping, then a certain percentage of those Christians are going, if they're disproportionately Christians who are doing this, then a disproportionate number of the Christians who survive they're going to survive because they came in contact and they were the ones who survived. And if the non-religious aren't doing this and they're just fleeing, well, you're not going to notice that. I don't have any idea. I don't have any idea. And neither does
I
anybody
also
else.
know that during that time, sanitation was not good. And if a Christian was reading the Bible and reading the Old Testament and seeing how God said after you touched something that was dead, you had to wash, you had to clean. I'm just wondering if some of the ones that survived weren't the ones that kind of followed God's rules on how to take care of cleanliness too. I don't know. But I can also tell you that in our country, we still have bubonic plague.
Yeah, we're going to get back.
And it tends to stem from out west because prairie dogs carry that flea that carries fleas, and those fleas can carry the bubonic.
Right. I don't have any opinion about why some people survive and some don't.
And well, that's not yet.
There were an awful lot of people who were trying to do the right thing who died. And there were an awful lot of people who tried to do the right thing and lived.
That's true too.
The death rates, but anyway, the death rates here are extraordinary. This is the point.
That's right.
As it sweeps its way around, mass panic, and it is going to result in a wholesale transformation of European society and culture and economics. Think about what might happen. So let's just go through these last few here in a few minutes. What's the death toll? Depends on who you talk to. They keep moving the numbers up. You'll see 25, 30, 50 million people die of plague in various estimates, 30, 50, 60%. And it seems to be moving up of Europe. So you can imagine the effect. If let's just say it's 50%, if COVID was a real threat, which it never was. It can't be a real threat if it's got a 1% death rate or 0.5% death rate. And disproportionately hits people who have a certain physical problems. But anyway, beyond that, you just imagine the effect in the United States if it killed 50% of the people that it came in contact with. And you had no idea why it was happening. It was just happening. And it hit everybody. So the farmers get wiped out, and it just hits every single demographic and every single sector of the economy. Healthcare, nurses, doctors, dentists, everybody, it doesn't matter. And they just get wiped out. And what that would do to life, to society, to American society. That's what they were up against. But one of the most important results of this was the end of what was called serfdom, which was you're a laborer, you have landowners, and you're a laborer, and you rented from the landowner, and you were entirely dependent on him. Entirely. He basically controlled your life. The landowner did. Now, there's no laborers. Then or landowners, they die. And so the laborers, if you're a landowner, suddenly you can't find laborers. So that makes labor more valuable. And suddenly the dynamic between the laborer and the landowner becomes transformed, because you can't just insist, because the guy has to work. He to some extent can bargain for his wages and what he wants. And that's a new thing. And so this serfdom that had always existed basically comes to an end, and European economics and society is transformed overnight. I mean, now there's all kinds of uncultivated land out there, whole different economics to work out. The population of Europe did not recover to its pre-pandemic levels for 150 years. To put COVID in perspective, 150 years before Europe got back to its pre-pandemic, pre-plague population. But more importantly for our purposes, think about what this did to religious authority. You have this narrative about the authority of the church. Church has the answers, tradition, and so forth. Then this happens. And you think it's a curse from God, which they did. There's lots of stories about that. You can Google it. And the church has no answers and is no help. The church is supposed to mediate, and it's just death and destruction all the way around you. And the church is impotent. And so it revealed something fundamentally, that's the right word, impotent, if you will, about church authority in the world. And that's delegitimizing. And that will now, I think, people who know more about this can talk about it, but I think that undermining of church authority is going to be fundamental to why then now there's going to be a period that's going to be known as Renaissance. It's interesting that the period known as the Black Plague, which was ferociously fast, 1347 to 1351, there were more instances of it for the rest of that century, but that not nearly as bad as that one, will immediately be followed by a period known as the Renaissance, which will culminate in things like the invention of the printing press, which will also transform society in the mid 1400s. I don't remember the exact, early 1400s, I don't remember the exact date. But there's the plague, and then now it's off to the races in the transformation of Western civilization. And we will be a product of that, right in here. Right, it's not a coincidence that the religious wars were 30 Years' Wars, 1618 to 1648. When did the Puritans come over?
1620, 1619.
And when was our nation founded? I mean, when was the Great Awakening? When was all that happening?
1732.
1700s. I mean, Yeah, they're all causally connected. And I think it starts here fundamentally with the Black Plague. Transformative effect on culture, on everything. So we'll pick it up there and we can begin talking about in a little bit the Reformation. When forces will be unleashed that nobody anticipated. Forces with the Black Plague, that was just the natural occurrence, but with the Reformation, forces will be unleashed by people unwittingly who don't know that what they're doing will have these effects that will reverberate far beyond what they even wanted. A guy like Luther, as a German who firmly believed in the national church, Luther. So we'll pick that up next time. Okay, anybody want the last word? It's 10:17. All right, then we'll go ahead and stop. And we'll see if I get any comments about that. I don't know what the heck I'm talking about. See ya.
Thank you, Gary.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Gary.
Yeah, see you, Gabe.
Yep, thanks.
See you, Kay.
Well, that's not.